Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will make my opening statement, then yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating, for his statement. On September 10th, 2014, President Obama announced that the United States would, quote, degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. That was a year ago. Obviously, ISIS didn't get the memo. The terrorist group keeps on moving across the Middle East, killing those who stand in its way by raping, pillaging, and murdering those who disagree with ISIS. ISIS controls half of Syria and large parts of Iraq. Civilized society is losing to these barbarians. Despite U.S. spending billions in a counterterrorism strategy, the terrorist group's numbers have not decreased. In fact, ISIS has grown in size with affiliates now all over the world, including Indonesia, Yemen, Egypt, and Libya. The U.S. $3.7 billion airstrike campaign has been plagued with little measurable successful results. From the very beginning, military officials warned that the airstrikes relied on virtually no human intelligence on-the-ground surveillance. They were right. Without good intelligence, the number of airstrikes the U.S. has carried out have been few, and the results are uncertain. Also, ISIS fighters killed by our airstrikes seem to be replaced immediately with other jihadists. Our intelligence estimates that ISIS's numbers are the same as they were when the airstrikes started. In addition, the administration's $500 million train and equip program has proved to be a failure by anyone's measure. In July, officials reported they had identified 7,000 planned participants, but only trained 60 due to intense vetting procedures and other excuses. Later that month, 54 fighters crossed into Syria to fight ISIS forces that numbered in the tens of thousands. Of those 54 mercenaries, virtually all were killed, captured, or scattered when attacked. We're now down to four or five trained mercenaries, according to General Lloyd Austin of CENTCOM. Despite this failed policy, just last week we sent a second group of about 70 U.S. trained fighters into Syria. Just one day later, reports suggested that one of the officers defected and surrendered his arms to al-Qaeda's Syrian affiliate. Several truckloads of weapons were allegedly traded to another terrorist group, al-Nusra, for safe passage through Syria. It's time to abandon this failed train and equip program. The reality is just as bleak on the online battlefield. ISIS has 30,000 to 40,000 social media accounts. It uses the internet to spread its propaganda, raise money, and find recruits as far away as Washington State. 2011, the administration promised a strategy to combat terrorist use of social media. 4 years later, the administration still has not shown us that strategy. No plan, no degrading of ISIS, no defeating of ISIS. The intel given to the administration has also reportedly been doctored to cover up how bad the war against ISIS was really going. Meanwhile, thousands of people are fleeing the Middle East, flooding Europe and demanding entry into other Western countries because of the ISIS carnage and chaos in Syria and Iraq. There is more. ISIS continues to recruit wannabe jihadists online for free via U.S.-owned social media companies. The administration continually is saying that everything is okay is an embarrassing wrong assessment of the violence and threat of ISIS. Today we are here to get frank assessment of the administration's counterterrorism strategy in Syria. In the face of our failure to destroy ISIS, we should be focusing on what we can do better, how we can improve our strategy in the future. ISIS's advances in Syria translate into more direct threats to our national security and our interests both home and abroad. ISIS wants to destroy the United States and everything the U.S. stands for. ISIS fears no one, certainly not the U.S., so it continues to murder in the name of its radical jihadist beliefs. It's already killed numerous Americans. We need a strategy that protects American people from this radical Islamic threat. Now we hear on the horizon that the Russians may intervene and help defeat ISIS. Who knows? The U.S. needs to define the enemy and defeat it. And that's the way it is, and I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for conducting this hearing, and I thank also our witnesses for being here today. The conflict in Syria is an open wound in the volatile Middle East. President Assad has brutalized, bombed, used chemical weapons on his own people, creating the conditions for ISIL and al-Qaeda to thrive in Syria and driving millions of Syrians to flee their country. The resulting refugee crisis has severely strained the resources of Syria's neighbors and exposing divides in Europe, which in some parts is already suffering from an intolerant brand of nationalism. The conflict in Syria is also drawing in foreign fighters who contribute to the instability and represent possible terrorist threats when they return to their countries of origin, including the United States. To put it mildly, the order of battle in Syria is complex. The United States has called for Assad to leave power and opposes ISIL and al-Qaeda affiliate al-Nusra. The United States supports so-called moderate Syrian opposition forces and the Syrian Kurdish group known as YPG. Meanwhile, our NATO ally Turkey, late to the fight against ISIL, opposes Assad and Kurdish militants, and the PKK as well, which also has close ties to our Syrian Kurdish allies, the YPG. Our sometimes allies against ISIL, Iraq, Iran, and Russia support the Assad regime, and our partners in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states oppose Assad and ISIL, while some individuals within these states provide funding to Sunni extremist groups in Syria. Given this tangled regional situation, which has been further complicated by Russia's recent movement of military equipment and personnel into Syria, the United States has, in my view, wisely refrained from introducing sizable ground force into Syria to combat ISIL. Yet, in concert with our partners, we must do more to counter and defeat ISIL, which controls significant territory in Syria and Iraq, as in extending its influence beyond the Middle East into Africa and Asia. ISIL's atrocities are horrific, and we must work to put a stop to its campaign of murder, slavery, and the destruction of cultural heritage. By virtue of its ideology, ISIL needs to control territory in order to survive, and to ultimately defeat ISIL, we need to assist our allies in the region in retaking that territory. The key questions, in my mind, are how will the United States and its partners sufficiently array its forces against ISIL to defeat it? And as we work to do this, how will we deal with the Assad regime, whose illegitimacy and brutality was the root cause of the Syrian civil war? We know that, to date, the plan to train and equip moderate Syrian fighters has not met its objectives. I hope that today's hearings will provide some constructive proposals on how, going forward, the United States and its allies can enhance counterterrorism efforts in Syria. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair recognizes the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sadly, the President's strategy in Syria is failing, resulting in refugees fleeing violence and then drowning at sea. According to a recent article in the New York Times, administration reports, quote, that coalition strikes killed about 10,000 Islamic State fighters. The group continues to replenish its ranks, drawing an average of about 1,000 new fighters per month, end of quote. The President was wrong to belittle ISIS to be JV, and he was wrong and made a mockery of the term red line. The failure of the train and equip mission of Syrian opposition forces has given enemy reinforcement space to insert itself and prop up the Assad dictatorship. The U.S. needs to change course and create a new strategy to defeat safe havens threatening American families at home. I believe it's important for the U.S. and international community to recognize that the situation in Iraq and Syria is in fact a global problem requiring broad international cooperation to promote stability in the region for families to prosper in their home nation.
The gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, for 1 minute opening statement.
No one in the administration is saying that everything is okay. The Shiite alliance is more dangerous than ISIS and more evil. They've killed far more Americans starting in the 1980s when Hezbollah attacked our Marines. And so if we confront ISIS, we have to do so in a way that does not empower Assad, Hezbollah, and Iran. You can attack U.S. policy, but we don't, as a nation, want to send troops into the ground, and we are living with the results of an absolutely failed policy of the last administration in Iraq, which installed Maliki, slightly improved now with al-Badi, The fact is the Iraqi government betrayed us this week in entering into a special intelligence alliance with Iran, Assad, and Russia. The train and equip program has been a failure. Due to political correctness, we have not armed those we know are not Islamic extremists, namely the Yazidis and the Christians. And due to diplomatic correctness, we have not armed the Kurds directly, but try to put everything through Baghdad. That does not mean we should abandon the train and equip program, which should have begun much earlier, as many on this committee argued, because what is the alternative? The chairman tells us we must defeat ISIS. Whose ground troops are going to do that? And what is a plan other than the administration's plan, poorly carried out in the case of the train and equip program, that will allow us to achieve that goal without massive American casualties? I yield back.
Expire. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry. 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In spite of its shortcomings, and there are many, the last administration's policy was not completely failed, and I would submit that the failure was after that president left and with the advent of the new policy. To that effect, in his September 2014 address from the White House, President Obama laid out a plan to degrade and ultimately destroy ISIL through a comprehensive and sustained counterterrorism strategy. In Syria, this goal was to be achieved with two major policies: a systematic campaign of airstrikes and increased support to forces fighting the Islamic State on the ground. A year later, what does this strategy currently look like? 11 sorties per day, yielding an average of 43 bombs dropped daily, a handful of Syrian rebels who would rather be fighting Assad at a cost of about $500 million to the American taxpayer. According to a report published recently by the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, ISIS has extended its territorial reach and now controls 50% of Syria, including most of the country's oil wells, which have proven to be a significant source of revenue. Mr. Chairman, I think it is high time this administration go back to the drawing board. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. Chair recognizes the gentleman, Mr. Rohrabacher, for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This administration has managed to turn a bad situation, which it did inherit, which was a bad situation that we created on this side of the aisle by going along with the president who precipitously invaded Iraq at a time when he hadn't finished in Afghanistan. But that bad situation this administration inherited has been turned into a catastrophe of this administration's making. U.S. policies, even our supplies sent to defeat ISIL, are now in the possession of radical Islamic groups that intend on killing Americans and other people who believe in our Western values. This administration has found every excuse to undermine the governments and the forces that are most friendly to our cause and the cause of peace. In Syria, we refused to cooperate with Russia 5 years ago, claiming that there was an alternative. And what happened in those 5 years? It's turned into an ever worse situation. And the money that was sent over to arm a third force, we now find has been used to train and equip hostile forces to those people who are trying to bring peace to the Middle East. Thank you for holding this hearing. Looking forward to getting the details.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will now recognize and introduce all three of our witnesses. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. General Jack Keane is the chairman of the board at the Institute of the Study of War. General Keane is a retired four-star general and the former vice chief of staff for the United States Army. Mr. Thomas Jocelyn is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and senior editor of The Long War Journal, a publication dealing with counterterrorism and related issues. And Ambassador Daniel Benjamin is the director of the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth. Ambassador Benjamin previously served as Ambassador at Large and coordinator for the counterterrorism at the United States State Department. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. General Keane, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the committee for inviting me back today. I'm honored to be here with my distinguished panel colleagues. The Middle East has experienced one of the most tumultuous periods in its history, with the old order challenged by the aspirational goals of the Arab Spring Islamic terrorists taking advantage of this political and social upheaval, and Iran using proxies to achieve regional influence and control. ISIS has become the most successful terrorist organization in modern history by dominating a large swath of Syrian and Iraq territory, while expanding its formal affiliations into 7 countries and developing a worldwide following. As you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, approximately a year ago, the President announced U.S. policy that in conjunction with our coalition partners, we would degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS. While there has been some progress looking at this strategy today, we now know the conceptual plan of Iraq first and minimal commitment in Syria is fundamentally flawed. The resources provided to support Iraq and Syria are far from adequate. The indigenous ground forces in Syria and Iraq are not capable of defeating ISIS. The air campaign rules of engagement are too restrictive. We have not impacted the ideology or ISIS recruiting, as 28,000 new recruits have arrived this year alone. As such, we are not only failing, we are losing this war. I can say with certainty our strategy will not defeat ISIS. ISIS, who is headquartered in Syria, recruits, trains, and resupplies in Syria. It is from Syria that ISIS has so successfully expanded, and it is from Syria that ISIS reaches out to 20,000 social media sites per day. They control large swaths of territory in Syria from Iraq border to Damascus. This territorial control is what differentiates it from other terrorist organizations, but it is also its greatest vulnerability. To defeat ISIS, we must take its territory away, as we did with Germany, Japan, and Korea. Yet we have no strategy to defeat ISIS in Syria. We have no effective ground force, which is the defeat mechanism. Air power will not defeat ISIS. It has not even been able to deny ISIS the ability to attack at will. ISIS grew to a terrorist army only because of the sanctuary in Syria. We cannot succeed in Iraq if ISIS is allowed to exist in Syria. The United States finds itself at a critical juncture. With its ISIS strategy failing, the Syrian civil war in its 4th year, and because the Assad regime this last year has been losing ground to the rebels and some political support, Vladimir Putin is executing a military buildup in Syria to ensure the survival of the Assad regime. Putin is also working to create an alternative anti-ISIS coalition that includes Russia, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, in a direct challenge to the U.S.-led coalition. In view of these very real challenges, what can we do? As to the strategy, Sun Tzu said, "Tactics without a strategy is the noise before defeat." And we have some noise. Once and for all, 22 years after the first World Trade Center bombing, 14 years after 9/11, we should develop in conjunction with our allies a comprehensive strategy to defeat radical Islam. Otherwise, we will continue to react to individual terrorist movements, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Ansar al-Sharia, Boko Haram, you name it, with no end in sight. As to Syria, recognize that an effective ground force is the key to defeating ISIS, with much less restrictive use of air power. The ground force should consist of the Syrian Kurds, the only force who has enjoyed success against ISIS in Syria. This force should be armed as required and provided special forces advisors to assist with the use of air power. Despite the dismal failure of the training and equip mission of the moderate Sunni Arab force, I agree with Mr. Sherman. It is still essential to put together this vital capability. The parameters for this force must change. We cannot restrict the Sunni Syrian Arabs to exclusively fighting ISIS when their priority is the Assad regime, who is destroying their communities and killing their families. They want to fight the Assad regime and ISIS. Let them. Also, this force and their communities must be protected, as should the Syrian Kurds. Begin by establishing free zones in the north and south, use coalition air power to include the Turks to enforce it, and permit the people to use the free zone as a sanctuary. advise Assad, if he challenges the free zone, then the U.S.-led coalition will shut down his air power. We must step up the use of our special operations forces to conduct routine ground raids, not just limited to drone raids. But the harsh reality is that the Syrian Kurds and the Sunni Arabs may not be sufficient to dislodge ISIS and defeat them in Syria, and the task may ultimately require an outside Arab coalition assisted by the United States ground and air components. As to Assad, while the United States and the coalition desires a political solution to the Syrian civil war, recognize that Assad will never depart unless the military momentum shifts against him. Despite Russia's military pressure, this should still be U.S. policy. As to Russia, once again, Putin is outmaneuvering the United States, and once again, he will outbluff us. Putin's economy is in the tank. His financial reserves are running out. His military is no match against the United States. He has deployed a relatively small military and limited capability to Syria, yet he will likely get what he wants, the preservation of the Assad regime. The United States should not coordinate any military operations with Russia. To do so, we are de facto in collusion with the Syrian regime, Iran, the Quds Force, and the Hezbollah. Putin is counting on President Obama's fear of escalation and fear of confrontation to force U.S. capitulation to Russia's ambition in Syria and the Middle East at large. This, in my view, is a game changer. There are no easy answers in Syria, but we don't have the luxury to say it's too hard and it's too complicated. There have been plenty of mistakes and lost opportunities, to be sure, but U.S. interest, U.S. security, and U.S. credibility is at stake. What is most needed now is U.S. determined leadership and resolve to commit to defeating ISIS, along with a revised, effective strategy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jocelyn.
Well, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, and other members of the committee, thank you for inviting me here today to speak about our counterterrorism efforts in Syria. As others have already said, the war is exceedingly complex. I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers for you, but I've heard a few things here already which are consistent with my testimony, and I want to highlight them in my oral testimony. First is sort of the necessity of removing territory from the Islamic State or ISIS. The Kurds have done a good job this year taking the northern third of the Raqqa province away from the Islamic State. But as David Ignatius in the Washington Post recently reported, they've been basically under-resourced. And for some reason, there's a holdup in getting them more resources to take that fight to the Islamic State. I don't know why that is. However, that seems to be the case. In that vein, I would say that the founding mythos of the Islamic State is that it is the resurrection of the caliphate, that they've brought this back to being a reality on this earth. And I think that as long as that myth exists and lives, that basically we're going to keep seeing more recruitment, we're going to keep seeing more people flock to the caliphate. Now, you're going to have some people who defect and who aren't happy and who go home, and we need to trumpet their messages. But as long as this founding myth that they are the caliphate and they control territory exists, they're going to keep going. And to that point, this morning the Treasury Department released what I think is really unprecedented, 35 terrorist designations at once this morning. Most of the designations deal with the Islamic State and underscore the degree to which the Islamic State has mushroomed. They deal with the Islamic State's provinces in the Khorasan and the Caucasus province, also the Islamic State's growing presence in the Sinai, and also, most importantly, deals with Western recruits who have gone to the Islamic State and pose some level of threat to their home countries. Now, the plots that have been, I think, highlighted in these designations aren't necessarily 9/11 style plots. These aren't these sort of spectacular events that we should all be worried about. But it shows that there is at least the seed of an idea of attacking their home countries there with some of the individuals who were designated this morning. One quick point to something Mr. Sherman said about Iran and Assad. I think even taking a step further, I think that they actually are the fundamental destabilizing force in the region and have actually fueled Sunni jihadism. Just last month, as we reported in the Long War Journal, the Islamic State brutally executed 4 members of the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq. They did so in a manner that was consistent with the way the Shiite extremists had previously executed Sunnis who they were fighting. And too often times in our media coverage, we get the ISIS video, which is sort of, glossy and highly stylized and something that's really there for the wow factor. But not enough attention is given to what's happening on the Shiite side, which is really driving this. And unfortunately, as long as Shiite extremism is expanding, what that does is it forces Sunnis more into the radicals camps, more into the jihadist camps, and that's not a good thing. And obviously, that underscores the idea that in the long run, Assad and Iran are not an answer to this at all. One further threat stream that I want to highlight today, and this goes to a lot of what we work on, and I think it's very poorly misunderstood, is the al-Nusra Front and the Sunni jihadists in Syria who are not aligned with the Islamic State and who are actually opposed with them. I think there's a gross misunderstanding of what they're doing, because what you don't hear often is that they are actually building their own state in northern Syria, in particular in the Idlib province. The al-Nusra Front is openly loyal to Ayman al-Zawahiri, the head of al-Qaeda. It is seated with senior al-Qaeda operatives, some of whom have actually trained and lived and worked with al-Qaeda going back to the 1980s. In a recent video, they highlighted the 9/11 attacks as something that's part of their legacy and their heritage, and said that this is they're the heirs of this glory. And their videos and propaganda show very clearly that al-Qaeda actually seeks to build an Islamic State or emirate as well in Syria. This is absolutely without a doubt. And in fact, if you look at the train and equip program and the recent problems with it, I think this is another fact that needs to be highlighted. The problems came not from ISIS. The problems came from al-Nusra Front or al-Qaeda. Going back to July, when members of Division 30 went into Syria, into the Aleppo province, it was al-Nusra that was waiting for them, that, as you said, Chairman Poe, killed and captured and basically disbanded this group very quickly. We were not expecting that for some reason on the U.S. side. Now, just recently, we have now an admission from CENTCOM saying that, in fact, several vehicles and ammunition at a minimum were turned over to al-Nusra Front in northern Syria, not ISIS, as part of a deal that was brokered to basically guarantee the safe passage for some of the people who were somehow affiliated with this program. I think this highlights, to a certain extent, that there's such a myopic focus on the Islamic State and such a drive to say the Islamic State is really the only threat we have to be worried about here, that basically a lot of times what's actually happening with these other groups is just as important, if not more so, in the long run. And finally, I'll say this. There's been somewhat of a public relations campaign to get the West to support, or at least tacitly support, some of these Sunni jihadists in Syria, including Arar al-Sham. That is a horrible idea. Members of the Obama administration have actually openly objected to that idea and said that that's a no-go. They are right in that regard. The Arar al-Sham should in no way be our partner in Syria. They cannot be. This is a group that openly says that the Mullah Omar's Taliban is a model for what they're building in Syria. It is deeply allied with al-Qaeda in Syria. It's had senior al-Qaeda veterans implanted in its ranks and seated in its ranks. This is a group that is absolutely not worthy of our support. And so I will end on a final warning, which is that these Sunni jihadists who are not Islamic State and are not affiliated and are actually against Assad, a lot of these groups are not our allies.
Thank you, Mr. Jocelyn. The Chair now recognizes Ambassador Benjamin.
Is that better? Good. Begin again. Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss the important issue of counterterrorism in Syria. Many have spoken of Syria as the problem from hell. Today, with upwards of 250,000 dead, more than 4 million Syrians in exile, a crisis in Europe and in Syria's neighborhood, and almost 8 million internally displaced, one can only say that Syria has descended to lower and darker circle of hell. And as many have mentioned, from an American perspective, the enduring safe haven that has been created in Syria and in Iraq is an outstanding problem for U.S. security. This hearing, moreover, comes at a moment of dangerous flux with the deployment of substantial numbers of Russian forces to Syria, and that appears to be a game changer for Western strategy. I think it's unlikely now that there will be any chance of removing Bashar al-Assad or his regime, or of the regime being pressured to come to the negotiating table on terms that it finds inhospitable. And I believe that it's important to look at the regional context as well. While a diplomatic solution will have to be found, and there is no military solution, has been said over and over again, we face a potential round of flux followed by equilibrium at a higher level of violence, with Sunni powers in the region supporting their proxies to fight against Assad, now backed by the Russians, and that in turn could raise the stakes from a counterterrorism perspective as well. It is a moment for innovative diplomacy, and I would just say that I share the view that we need to show more flexibility on the issue of the fate of the Assad government. And while ultimately a leader has committed the atrocities on the scale that Bashar al-Assad has cannot be allowed to stay in power, humanitarian and counterterrorism concerns demand that we be flexible about the modalities of that departure. As others have noted, the key shortcoming in Syria and Iraq remains the absence of a capable ground force, which is essential for achieving the kind of success against ISIL that we seek to achieve. Here there are two critical problems. What has been mentioned, the weak showing on equipment train needs no further discussion here. But equally, I think it's important to understand, again, the regional context, which is that our coalition partners are far from engaged in this struggle as seriously as we would like. While Western allies are showing growing commitment, and we should all welcome France's decision to launch airstrikes against targets in Syria, the Saudis and the smaller Gulf states remain principally interested in the sectarian conflict, and Exhibit A in that regard is the conflict of Yemen, where humanitarian catastrophe is also unfolding. And Saudi Arabia's determination to extirpate the Houthis in Yemen is receiving far more attention and resources than the effort to roll back ISIL and Sunni extremism. Our and our allies' agendas are at odds, and that is going to be a continuing problem in this extraordinarily difficult situation. But that said, I still think that the strategy we have, while hardly ideal, is the best one available to us. For all its grotesque violence, ISIL has not yet manifested itself as a first-tier terrorist threat to the United States. It has not yet shown significant interest in out-of-area attacks. I believe that will change the more we bomb them. But for the time being, I don't think they can be said to be an al-Qaeda-like threat. They have not devoted the effort to long-distance covert operations the way al-Qaeda did. Much has been made about the threat of foreign fighters. I would point out that there's only been one case so far of a foreign fighter coming back to his home country and carrying out an attack. That was in Brussels. We see an awful lot of radicalized young individuals who want to be part of the team, want to show that they are part of this historic movement. But this kind of violence, which remains low level, and I would say non-existential certainly, is the new normal in jihadist terrorism. It's not something to sniff at, but it is certainly less threatening than the catastrophic attacks we feared after 9/11. I agree with Mr. Jocelyn about the importance of the myth of the caliphate and holding territory. That has galvanized lots of extremists, but I would suggest that we have a number of tools at our disposal. We are seeing an accelerating campaign of drone and other airstrikes that are taking out senior officials of ISIL, and I believe that over time this will throw the group off balance and make it harder for them to achieve their military or their state-building objectives. And I think over time that will also make a ground campaign more attractive to some of our allies who we hope will get involved. I remain strongly opposed to putting U.S. boots on the ground. This would be a repetition of the surge and would only address symptoms and not the causes. I have a lot more to say, but I look forward to your questions.
Thank the gentleman. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Is it in our national security interest that ISIS be defeated? General?
Yes, absolutely. In my judgment, I mean, we are talking about it is a national security interest for us, for stability and security in the Middle East. It is in our national security interest dealing with our allies, obviously, who are being impacted by ISIS. And I also believe that ISIS, left unattended, will eventually become more of a direct threat to the American people at large. And I think the evidence is already there in terms of the fertility for something like that to take place. Certainly there is the intent.
Ambassador Benjamin, did I hear you correct? Did you say that Assad, he's going to stay in Syria? At some point, he'll be the leader, the president, whatever, of a portion of Syria, or not?
Mr. Poe, first, let me just say I fully agree that over the long term we want ISIL to be defeated, but I think that the key here is strategic patience, and that we should do it in a way that comports with our long-term interests and doesn't result in another mistaken deployment. As for
Strategic
Assad,
patience, does that mean that we let ISIS get a pass for a few years? And
no, I think it means that we continue striking them, and we've now carried out roughly 6,000 airstrikes.
are you
against.
saying those airstrikes have been successful in stopping ISIS?
I think that they have done a good job at containing ISIS, and I think that containment, unfortunately, is the solution of the moment.
You agree with that, General King?
No, absolutely, it's not true. What has happened is CENTCOM has chosen to use activity-based analysis to provide some impact of what ISIS is doing. Therefore, we receive information that says number of air attacks, number of vehicles destroyed, and we haven't been counting bodies since Vietnam, number of people killed. How we come to that conclusion is beyond me. What we're not doing in terms of the analysis that you're not receiving, but it is inside the CENTCOM headquarters, is matrix-based analysis that looks at the enemy and says, how effective is their command and control? What is their tactical and operational initiative? What is their territorial control? Has it gone up, gone down? Where is it now? What is their capability to regenerate forces? What degree of resiliency that they have? All of those things I just mentioned, plus 4 or 5 others, are all to the plus, which tells you that the air campaign is not nearly as effective as it could be, and it certainly is not having any significant impact on those categories which is the way we judge an enemy force.
Mr. Benjamin, Ambassador Benjamin, without going into that issue more, I mean, I think the General's right and you're wrong. This is not defeating ISIS. I would think they would applaud the same type of lack of strategy because they're expanding. But answer my question, is Assad here to stay in Syria or a portion of Syria, now that the Russians are involved? Is that what you said? I'm just asking that question.
What I said, sir, was that over the long term, Assad needs to go. That, I believe, is consistent with our values and the revulsion of the international community, but that we should think hard about how we sequence that and whether or not we agree to let him, for example, remain throughout his elected term in order to deal with the fact that the Russians are simply not going to leave ahead of time. I also would point out, sir, that otherwise we are right now in a conflict in which we're fighting both sides from a middle that doesn't exist.
More than one side, reclaiming my time.
Yeah.
Now that the Russians are involved, Putin, Napoleon of Siberia now moving into the area, you got Russia, Assad, Iran now working together. How does that issue impact our strategy, lack of strategy, or a future strategy in defeating ISIS? General, you want to try?
Certainly. Well, first of all, it is a reality, but we should not let Putin and his limited military capability that he's providing take us off what our strategy is, which is to defeat ISIS and put together an effective ground force in Syria to do that, and also do the same thing in Iraq, and provide the number of resources that we need to do that. I would tell Mr. Putin that I'm going to fly my airplanes where I want, when I want. I'm going to do what I want with them, and you're not going to interfere with them, period. I mean, the idea of deconflicting operations with Putin is ridiculous. There's no reason to do something like that. We have to stand up for what our goals are in that country, in Syria, and also in Iraq. Putin is played a card here, and he's gotten away with it in 2013 on the chemical weapons. He got away with it in Crimea, and he got away with it in Ukraine. And given that encouragement that we provided him, he's playing another one. I do agree with this, Mr. Chairman. It does solidify what was happening to the Assad regime. They were losing Alawites, erosion of support, not to the point where he was going to be removed, but it was eroding. And the rebels were gaining on him, particularly in Idlib province, and that was Jabhat al-Nusra. And he knew that, and that sanctuary that they have, that Alawite sanctuary, was being threatened. The Iranians provided them the detailed information on that because their intelligence is better, and that's what this move is about, to solidify the Assad regime. And that will happen to a certain degree. But if we continue the momentum against the Assad regime and support that and support issues against ISIS, I believe at some point we'll be able to work a deal to get Assad out of there.
Thank you, General. I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to touch on one issue and maybe get back to some of the other issues we were discussing, but start with Ambassador Benjamin. That's the role of Turkey, and Turkey is an effective partner. Within hours after the U.S. Had an agreement with Turkish officials to use the Air Force bases to launch airstrikes against ISIL, Turkey launched airstrikes against PKK in northern Iraq, the Syrian Kurdish group, and the YPG has close ties to the PKK and is one of the most effective anti-ISIL forces in Syria. So, plus, although they're improving, I think Turkey's also been one of the most, probably the most main transit site for a country where foreign fighters are flowing into Syria. Now, what can we do to better work with Turkey? I think it's critical that they become an effective partner for us.
Well, it is critical that they become an effective partner for us, but I would say that diplomacy with Turkey is an extraordinarily vexed problem, Mr. Keating. And Turkey has made clear that its #1 priority is the removal of Assad. And complicating that is that President Erdogan has decided to essentially tack back against one of his greatest achievements, which was ameliorating tensions between Turks and Kurds in his own country by striking out against Kurds for political gain. And while we do benefit from being able to fly out of Incirlik now, we have an enormously challenging problem because the Turks are dead set against increased influence for the YPG or any other Kurdish group outside of Turkey. So the diplomacy there is extraordinarily difficult, and again, the Turks are increasingly concerned about ISIL, but they are nowhere nearly as concerned about ISIL as they are about Assad, which has become an obsession. His removal has become an obsession for Mr. Erdogan.
I couldn't agree. I was in Turkey just 4 months ago, and I agree with you that in their hierarchy of their concerns, Assad is first, the Kurds second, and then ISIL maybe third, maybe. So that creates a problem that I see. I don't know if any of the other witnesses want to see how we could better deal with Turkey, if that's possible at all.
I'll echo Mr. Benjamin's honorable remarks here about dealing with Turkey, because I think diplomacy there is very difficult to deal with them. But I'll say this: Turkey, in my opening remarks, I highlighted Arar al-Sham as a group that's not our partner in Syria. They're a member of the Jaish al-Fatah coalition, which is led by Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda. Arar al-Sham fights hand in glove with al-Qaeda, al-Nusra Front, throughout all of Syria. Arar al-Sham also happens to be Turkey's preferred proxy in the fight in Syria. And this is a group we profiled. I've probably written 100 articles on them about now at Long War Journal. And there's no doubt about what Arar al-Sham is. This is a Sunni jihadist group that's allied with al-Qaeda. It's being set up to be basically the long-run Taliban in Syria. Basically, the al-Qaeda-Taliban relationship pre-9/11, you think about having these local Syrian forces that could basically be a face for Sunni jihadism in Syria. That's what Arar al-Sham is. And Turkey is the #1 backer at this point of Arar al-Sham.
Okay.
The only thing I would add is, listen, that all the problems that Turkey's given us, to be sure, but nonetheless, in mid-July, they came to an agreement with the United States to establish, for want of another term, a free zone with us, and to enforce that free zone using air power. So that is a beginning and a recognition that will provide some relief in terms of sanctuary relief for people who need that measure of protection. And of course, that serves their self-interest in terms of migration across their border with refugees, but it's also a way of protecting a ground force. And I think that's a positive thing. It's something we can work with.
Good. General, I appreciate you're going forward with direct comments, but the difficulty I have trying to find out how to follow through deals with the use of ground troops as well. And you say that we have to have the U.S. and our allies engage in those ground troops to be successful. Two things. Number one, how do we get our allies? The conversations I've had are not encouraging with our Western allies participating. Number two, let's assume we did. Let's assume we were successful. What do you see for the time frame of those ground troops having to hold that territory?
The issue we have, and you mentioned in a discussion with the panel, is every one of our allies on the border there, their number one issue is Assad. And it's not that ISIS isn't important to them, but they want the focus to be the removal of that regime and what it's been largely doing to Sunnis, you know, who is what their constituency is within their own countries. And that's why I thought a more aggressive strategy in dealing with Assad early on, going back a few years, this is one of the lost opportunities we had to build a capable force that pretty much has gone by the wayside in a sense, because if you remember, the national security team from this administration offered as an opportunity in the summer 2012. But that we should never lose that focus, because I don't think they will participate as a ground force, an Arab coalition ground force, as long as that regime is there. But when you talk to them, once the removal of that regime, and then they're willing to entertain the thought of taking some kind of ground action against ISIS if it's still warranted at that time. And I suspect, even though we should try some of these other options, and I think the administration is looking at some different options, I'm not certain those options are going to be successful.
Great. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador Benjamin was going to comment on this. I hope he has the opportunity to do that with other questions. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jocelyn, what were the factors that led to the complete failure of the original batch of U.S.-trained Syrian fighters that crossed into the country from Syria in July, if you know, from your perspective?
What happened, and we were watching this, ironically enough, on social media. Al-Qaeda on Nusra has all sorts of social media accounts, and they basically were taunting us as this was ongoing, releasing a statement saying that they had basically captured or killed a number of the Division 30 forces, they're called, as they crossed into Aleppo in northern Syria. The problem here was that it wasn't thought, based on press reporting, that in fact Al-Qaeda in Syria was going to interfere with an American-backed effort, which I think was short-sighted. I don't know who made that call or who made that choice, but that's what's said in the press reporting. And so it wasn't ISIS that interfered with this; it was al-Nusra or Al-Qaeda that did. And they quickly, what they did was, after basically intercepting these guys as they were sent into Syria, they then went and raided their headquarters north of Aleppo, which the U.S. then set in air cover to try and kill them, and actually probably killed dozens of Al-Qaeda fighters during the conflict. But the end result was that these 54 fighters that went into Syria were quickly disbanded.
I mean, 54 is a pretty. What was the force opposed to them when they came in? Do you have any idea? I mean, what 54? I've just picked.
It's a drop in the bucket. I mean, the point is,
you got a platoon of fighters.
I mean, Nusra Front, by comparison, and this wasn't even factored in the strategy, easily has thousands upon thousands of jihadists now. If you just look at their operations on a day-to-day basis, and they're not even ISIS. And then you go deal with ISIS and all the other factors there.
Hey, General Keane, in what ways do you believe the recent Iran nuclear deal will affect counterterrorism efforts in Syria? I know that's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but can you draw a thread for us and put some points on it that we can maybe see some milestones if you can think of some?
Well, I think it's pretty self-evident. I mean, the progress that the Iranians have made in the last 35 years using proxy clients to sponsor terrorism for them and also to execute military operations for them have led to significant influence and control in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iraq. And with close to $150 billion worth of funding that's going to be returned to their coffers, which is a significant percentage of their GDP, I think if we just estimate that likely 20–30% go to domestic needs to appease a population and keep them out of the streets, and most of it will go to their number one strategic objective is not a nuclear weapon. Their number one strategic objective is to dominate and control the region. And that is where that money will go. And that will mean Hezbollah funding. It'll certainly mean Quds Force funding, both of who are on the ground in Syria. And I may say making a significant contribution. Also on the ground in Syria, but no longer there, but to help prop up the Assad regime before ISIS invaded Iraq was thousands of Iraqi Shia militia that were all trained by the Iranians. So that will be the mainstay of where most of that money will go. It will not just impact Syria, it will impact other countries in the region, but certainly it will have impact on Syria.
Keeping with that kind of the thought, the implications of Russian forces in Syria, and especially in light of the Assad regime's recent use of Russian warplanes to carry out airstrikes. You kind of talked about this briefly before. Do you believe the U.S. can still, do we have the resolve? What are the implications? What are the challenges to us instituting a no-fly zone, should we choose to, with the advent of Russian forces proper being in country?
Well, I think, you know, the free zone also would obviously be a no-fly zone. We would not tolerate the Assad regime, you know, bombing a free zone. So I think it's a no-fly zone has a little bit of a third rail for this administration. So I think a free zone is a better word, and also it's a place where, you know, refugees can go to seek sanctuary. But look at what
Are we going to be mixing it up with Russian planes? Are American fighter pilots going to be mixing it up with?
I don't see any reason why the Russians would do something like that. They've got some intercept airplanes. They're called Su-24s. They've got some multi-role fighters on the ground, and they got some close air support airplanes. They have about a squadron of fighters. They've got about a squadron of Hinds and Hips, and they've got a half a dozen drones. That's a limited air capability. They've got some ground forces and some tanks, about a battalion size, to sort of protect the air base and the greater air base and the base they're forming north of that. That's not a power projective offensive ground force. You push it out so you don't have Jabhat al-Nusra lobbing mortars at their air base and interfering with their operations. It is a limited military capability designed to have significant political impact, and I believe it will have significant political impact. He knows what he's doing.
Thank you, General. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the beginning, I said that the Shiite alliance was more dangerous, more evil, killed more innocent Muslims, killed more Americans than ISIS has. What I should point out, what I failed to point out at the beginning is, but ISIS is far more gruesome. Assad will kill 1,000 people with barrel bombs and have the good taste to deny it. ISIS will behead a dozen people and put it up on YouTube. There have been those who have blamed the United States for everything and said we've accomplished nothing. I would point out for the record that ISIS was on its way to take Baghdad, at least the Sunni neighborhoods in Baghdad, and it was American air power that stopped them. Speaking of Baghdad, this is an ally that may not be worthy of very much American support. Ambassador, do you know how much money we spend propping up that regime this year? We got thousands of troops there. We give them lots of free weapons. Any idea what the price is?
I'm afraid I couldn't give you
Okay,
a
we'll
number.
try to find out for the record. But this is a regime that has oil revenues, present and future, that will not commit to repay us with future oil revenues. It's a regime that sends money to ISIS. It pays the civil servants in Mosul, which means they're giving money to people under ISIS control. It, I believe, gives Mosul free electricity, for which ISIS can collect. But most importantly, ISIS seized all those banknotes. The Iraqi regime will not recall them, as many countries do, and issue new currency. And of course, the reason for that is that really makes it tough to be a corrupt politician, because you have your store of money in the old banknotes. We're losing the cyber war. The number one thing ISIS has is it does control territory, but the second thing is that they're just that our message in cyberspace is terrible. One of the reasons for that is that we don't have anybody on our team who's paid to understand Islam. We think that if we can just prove that al-Baghdadi beheaded innocent girls, that will undercut his support. It may increase his support. He may put that up on YouTube. What we fail to realize is if we can catch him eating a ham sandwich, that's what will undercut his support. Ambassador, while you were in government, if you wanted to call a U.S. government employee whose full-time job was to be a true expert in Sharia, in the Quran, in the Hadith, was there anybody who was a U.S. government employee you could call on who had memorized the Quran? Which is kind of a basic level of Islamic scholarship.
Yes, there are. I'm sure there are many.
Did you ever call on one? Can you name one? Because I've been told again and again that the State Department refuses to hire anyone for their knowledge of Islam. Now, for all I know, our ambassador to Paraguay is a Muslim, is a devout Muslim, but he's focused on Paraguay. Who would you call? What office?
Well, so if I wanted an intelligence briefing, I'd call the intelligence.
Is there anybody in the intelligence service
There are many, many, many people.
who are true
Yes.
graduates of the top Islamic scholarship schools?
No, but there are many other ways of acquiring that kind of
There's
knowledge.
there's many other ways. Look, we hire thousands of lawyers at the State Department. We've got people on salary because they understand European diplomatic law of the 1800s. We don't have anybody who's memorized the Quran.
That's just not true, sir.
That's not true? Well, can you name anybody who has?
Not sure that that's the standard.
Okay. How about the standard of being able to apply both Sunni and Shiite hadith to the behavior of individual actors?
We have many people who can.
We have many people, but you can't name one.
I'm not
And
at
other
liberty to
testimony
talk
from the
about
State
the-
Department,
about
they've said they
employees of
refuse
the
to hire
CIA.
anybody to do that. But when you say intel, that means they're not involved in public
We also have
diplomacy.
people in the intelligence part of.
Okay, so you're saying the intel community advises our public diplomacy and our cyber communications efforts?
Absolutely.
That's an interesting role for intel to be doing on a day-to-day basis. I have yet to find a single communication from the State Department showing the hypocrisy and the failure to follow Islamic law of our enemies in the Middle East. Nor can you name a single person that has this, but you're sure
Yes,
they're
sir,
there.
But I can show you 100 different pieces put out by the Center for Counterterrorism Strategic Communications that have done exactly that.
Yes,
You
and
haven't
none of
watched them,
them
I'm
by
afraid.
somebody who would be mid-level at any of the top Islamic schools in the world. They've listened to the Great Courses summary of the Islamic
So that's
religion.
an absolutely
no,
unacceptable slur on some truly remarkable
I've
scholars.
asked you what post in the State Department is hired for their knowledge.
INR.
IR.
INR, Intelligence and Research.
Intelligence
Also,
and-
NEA has experts.
Okay, I've called over there many times, and they've told me nobody, and you're telling me there's somebody, but you can't name them, and you know that they're only going to hire people with fancy degrees from Princeton, not scholarship from the major Islamic universities. Maybe there's some other reason why our cyber efforts are so pitifully poor when it comes to confronting ISIS.
A major reason why our cyber efforts are inadequate, sir, is that Congress has never funded them at an adequate level.
We funded them far more than ISIS is funded, and it's not like they've accomplished 10% of what they should have. It's not like you come to us with a success story and say we can do 10 more. We have the largest public diplomacy effort in the world and the greatest failure in the world. And we are losing to people who behead children. We should be able to do a better job.
Well, so this is a much longer conversation, sir, but the fact is that they have right now a story that is very attractive to disaffected Muslims in many countries around the world, and we don't. And that's a real problem. What would you propose that that message be? Come to the United States where you can't get a visa? What exactly should the message be to people who find that to be a really attractive possibility? to see the
first and
historical
foremost would be a
realities?
review of Islamic scriptures to demonstrate how what ISIS is doing is violative of them.
You know, sir,
And
the
getting
government
a
has done this
visa to the-
over and over again, and it's found out that when the U.S. tells Muslims what is Islamic and what is not, we fail.
We don't have to do the telling. We can be beseeching those who can issue the fatwas, but we don't have the
Do that
background.
too.
The chair recognizes the other gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you. With all due respect to my colleague from California, who we agree with most of the time, I would have to say that certainly the cooperation between our intelligence services and public diplomacy are not only strong but expected to be strong. That's part of their job, and I know they work with various people. I spent 7 years in the Reagan White House, and I don't think that they're any different now than they were then. There's a wide range of cooperation there with the intelligence community. So whether that they come up with the right policies or decisions is something else again. Anyway, I could go into great detail for you, but I was a speechwriter for President Reagan, and I can tell you that there was a great deal of resources available on how people think in that part of the world and what will appeal to them, et cetera, at least during the Reagan administration. I don't know, maybe they don't do that anymore.
If the gentleman will yield, I've called over there seeking information from people who would qualify as Islamic scholars, and they've said, we don't hire any of those.
Well, maybe that's just what they tell congressmen, you know, maybe they got their own little...
Well, they're either doing a bad job or they're lying to Congress, and I'll leave it to our witness to tell us which it is. I yield back.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I'm concerned about a couple things, and one of the things I'm most concerned about is that we end up using our own money and our own tax dollars that have been used in the name of fighting this horrible threat of radical Islamic terrorism. Of course, we have a president, I might add, who I don't seem to remember having been able to utter those words, radical Islamic terrorist. But I'm afraid that the money that we've been spending, that much of it has gone and ended up in the hands of the people who are radical Islamic terrorists. This third force that the administration insisted that we support in Syria, rather than going with Assad, which is what the Russians were proposing, I understand that third force now is proven that it's actually now working with ISIL, and that some of their commanders, who we have been paid on the payroll up until 2013, are now engaged in activity with these terrorists. Is that correct? General, do you guys know anything about that?
I have no knowledge of that.
What, the third force just, yes, sir, go ahead.
The most recent reports are actually that someone in the new Syrian force, a commander who may or may not have been vetted to be trained, it's not clear to me based on what CENTCOM is saying, and CENTCOM's storyline over the last week has evolved. But a commander from this force may or may not have defected to al-Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda in Syria.
Right.
He certainly, whether or not he was vetted or not to be directly involved in the program, he certainly provided, according to CENTCOM, equipment and ammunition to al-Nusra Front, which is al-Qaeda, which is U.S. supplied equipment and supplies directly to al-Qaeda.
Well, so there's ample evidence that this has been going on. Maybe we haven't proven the case yet, but I will just say that I think the idea that we should just create a third force on our own and go out there and support it with people that we don't know, basically, because we're creating a new force, I think has been a catastrophe for the stability of the Middle East. And let me ask about that again. Why is it that you have Assad? I mean, during World War II, we sided with Hitler, as I might say Putin acknowledged the other day at his speech. He says, "Hey, you worked with us to defeat Hitler. We walked away from being the Soviet Union, and yet you still won't work with us, even in the Middle East, against these radicals." Why is it that Assad, being a bad guy, but knowing that he doesn't intend to kill Americans, why aren't we helping, going along with the idea of going over there and helping the bad guy who wants to kill people who want to murder Americans? That makes all the sense in the world to me. Maybe we should have worked with Putin and it would have been better off. But if you want to refute that, go right ahead.
Mr. Rohrabacher, I would make a few arguments. First, we faced an existential struggle in World War II that I think made collaborating with Stalin's Russia an entirely different proposition from collaborating with a mass killer like Hafez al-Assad. I don't think that our vital interests are in any way engaged in the region in the way that we experienced in
So you're saying that Assad was worse than Stalin?
World War II. No, I'm not saying. I'm saying it's a different situation, and therefore we should employ different standards. But I think the other thing that's been lost sight of here is that were we to side with Assad, or were we to put a ground force into Syria to combat ISIL, we would quickly find ourselves without an awful lot of our allies in the Sunni Arab world, allies who we have long and historic relationships with, and who we have many differences with right now, but who we still do not want to fully alienate. And I would count among them Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, and Kuwait.
Sure. So all of these countries, like the Saudis, who actually paid for the pilots to fly planes into our buildings at 9/11, we're going to be worried about what the Saudis have to tell us. You know, I'll tell you one thing. At least certain these ISIL people are right up front that they want to murder us. We put up with Pakistan and we put up with Saudi Arabia, and I think we are giving ourselves some sort of delusion about what the real world's all about. And I don't know what we've done to punish Saudis about what they did to help on 9/11, but radical Islam is our enemy, and the Saudis have financed it. And some of the very same people you're talking about have been financing ISIL, have they not? Some of the same governments you just mentioned have financed ISIL. Isn't that correct?
No, I don't believe there's any evidence that any of those governments have financed ISIL. I think that there have been cases in which some of them have financed other groups that we would consider too extremist for our support.
Who
and
then
we would
became
consider
ISIL.
worrisome.
And
What?
who then became ISIL. And anyway,
not
it's
aware of
very
that.
complicated. This is a complicated world. It's not something that can be just done with slogans. I understand that, and we need all the guidance we can get and all the information. The general and I had a good talk out in the ante room beforehand about his various ways of analyzing a situation, which I found to be very helpful. And thank you. I had to go into the back room we had a meeting with the Japanese, a Japanese delegation I had to meet with. I will read your testimony and look at it. Thank you for your advice today, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. The chair will recognize a member not of this committee, but certainly welcome to ask questions, Ms. Sheila Jackson-Lee from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank Mr. Chairman very much, and to the ranking member, and let me thank you very much for convening a very important hearing. As a member of the Homeland Security Committee and Judiciary and a former member of this committee, I've dealt with these issues quite frequently. So I'm just going to raise questions based upon my following of this, and I'm going to raise these questions with Mr. Benjamin. I know it's difficult to maybe give a precise answer, but let me try to probe that. Let me just take something from speculation and news articles that the driving of the Syrian refugees, tragic. No one will forget the 3-year-old. A picture of that will remain stained in our hearts and our minds. Do you think there was a strategy to drive those refugees at the time that they were into Europe, which was not prepared, even though the generosity of Germany was noted, to destabilize their resettlement program? I'm just going to start there and work my way back to Syria. Do you have any sense of how those refugees, at the large numbers that they were coming into Europe at that time?
No, I'm afraid I don't. I can't say exactly what the trigger was. There were a number of things that happened on the ground in Syria that I think convinced Syrians that the situation was only going to get more dire. I don't think that there was anything that was done intentionally to disrupt European affairs, although I do think that some of the Central and Eastern European countries that were way stations for the refugees saw it in their interest to hustle them out of the country towards Austria and Germany as fast as they could.
My concern, and I'll go now back to Syria, 2 years ago, many of us were supporting the Syrian American community and still do in terms of, if we were back 1 or 2 years ago, about supporting that military that was a Syrian, I believe, military component that was against Assad, to provide them with the support systems that they needed. And obviously it didn't come full circle for that to occur. We now find ourselves with the vacant space or the vacuum of which ISIL has been able to take up residence, take up violence, establish the caliphate, and to destroy any source of life that we possibly could have. Do you have a position on what I think the President has offered, is that Assad must go, but there is room for his leaving to be tempered or to be, if you will, established through a process? Do you see any good intentions in Russians' effort to maintain that Assad must stay? And of course, now not only is there a caliphate, but yet Russia now has seemingly an open door in Syria. It certainly has assets that it wants to protect, resources it wants to protect. And how do you see that playing out? Is Russia going to be an effective partner? Is Russia's dominance of Syria going to be a detriment to trying to get it stabilized for the good people of Syria that I met when I was in Damascus and spent time there, who want to come back and reclaim their country?
Well, you've asked a number of very good questions, and some of them are hard to answer. I think the short story here is that we do not know the full scope of President Putin's designs in Syria. He has talked about putting together a coalition to fight ISIL. And I think that there are intense conversations going on, as there were yesterday at the UN, between the President and Putin on exactly this issue. I think that it is important to underscore that Russia has long looked at Syria as one of its very small numbers of true, reliable allies. And that has been true for many decades at this point. And so it's not entirely surprising that Russia decided to take this step to support this one very reliable ally. And I think that the President, or the administration, I should say, is making a number of noises, is suggesting that there may be more room for discussing the long game in terms of Assad. But I think it's quite clear that Russia is not going to throw him overboard anytime soon. And we don't have a lot of leverage there to affect that. So that is why I said in my statement earlier that I think that ultimately, because of the crimes he's committed, Assad will need to go. But I think that there's a lot more flexibility in thinking about how that might happen now in Washington and around the world.
The General looks like he wants to answer.
General. That's a very interesting question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
First of all, the reason why the Russians came is because Assad, for this last year, has been losing territory, particularly northern territory, and particularly in Idlib province, mainly due to Jabhat al-Nusra. And also, he's begun to erode his political base in terms of the Alawites, possibly thinking about somebody else. So, 60-year relationship with Russia, former Soviet Union, over 100,000 Russians before the Civil War began actually live in that belt, of that Alawite belt. A base on the Mediterranean, the only base that he has outside of Russia itself. He cannot, in his own self-interest, lose the strategic interest he has in Syria. It is his foothold in the Middle East. So here he comes. And he's going to prop up this regime. That is the main reason he's there. He's creating a bit of another narrative. It's about ISIS. It's about propping up the regime. And here's where I agree totally with President Obama in his UN speech. Because what that does then, what Putin is saying is, I am reinforcing the status quo inside Syria. And that means a humanitarian catastrophe that we have been watching for 4 years will continue because Putin is going to subsidize that regime and make certain it doesn't fall. And remember, Assad has been making war on his people for these 4 years. It's not just barrel bombing, it's systematic genocide, starvation in towns and neighborhoods, destroying every food factory that they can destroy, bread factories, canned food factories, et cetera. 62% of all hospitals he's destroyed because that's another way of killing people if you can't be treated. 70-something% of all ambulances. And now the use of chlorine gas. It is a very methodical, systematic way he's using to kill his population. This is what Putin is underwriting, and this is the status quo that the President spoke about when he said the carnage will continue. That, I believe, will happen, as sad as that is.
Chair thanks
Thank
the
you.
witnesses
Thank you
and the
both.
gentlewoman. Chair
Thank you.
thanks the members as well. At this point, this subcommittee hearing is adjourned.